Welcome to Biology Made Easy. Today, we would like to understand the structure and function of the mammalian heart. And we are going to discuss the atria, ventricle, the muscle, and the functions. We'll also discuss the valves, cuspid, aortic, pulmonary valves. We'll look at the papillary muscle, chordae, tendineae together. We'll look at the ring of muscles of vena, cavae, and pulmonary vein. We'll look at the muscle of the heart in relation to its myogenic nature. We'll look at the nodes, the two nodes, atrioventricular node and then sinoatrial node. We'll also quickly look at heart sounds. Well, the atria and ventricle muscle, we have a section of the heart quickly drawn here. We have the left atrium, left ventricle, right atrium, right ventricle. You notice that the heart is a four-chambered structure, but actually divided into two major parts, the left and the right, by the septum. The right contains deoxygenated blood, the left contains oxygenated blood. What is the function of the atrium and the functions of the ventricle? Quickly, the atria receive blood from the body. So blood enters the atria. Now, blood comes into the left atrium via the pulmonary vein. Blood enters the left atrium from the lungs. And blood enters the right atrium from the vena cavae. You have anterior vena cava and the posterior vena cava. I have a question. Looking at the insert, you will see some blood vessels stuck in here with an arrow. What is that vessel? Those two vessels are the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins coming from the right side of the right lung. So take note if you have that to work out in exams. While the atria receive blood from the body, the ventricles pump blood to the body. The right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs. So here is it. Right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. Blood leaves like this. This goes to the left lungs. This goes to the right lungs. Right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs. And then the left ventricle pumps blood to all parts of the body through the aorta. So here you have left ventricle, blood flows from it to all parts of the body. So this is the aorta. Branches of it goes to the head. That's the carotid arteries. Branch of it here is subclavian, goes to the arm. And this dorsal aorta supplies blood to all parts of the body down. So here is the dorsal aorta. So these are the functions of the atria and the ventricle. So the left takes blood to the rest of the body. And we have shown that it does that through the aorta branches, as we have mentioned. So this is the functions of the atria and the ventricles. Now we want to look at the muscle of the atria and the muscle of the ventricles. Now these two atria, the muscle is thin. Thin muscle because of two reasons. One of the reasons is that it contains blood of low pressure, because before blood comes into the atria, they've gone through capillary bed, and so the blood that comes in through the pulmonary veins, it has gone through the lungs, so it's low pressure. The blood that comes into the right atrium, the vena cavae, has gone through the whole body, through capillary beds, and so low pressure. The main reason why the atria are thin is that the atria only pumps blood into the ventricles, right? Meanwhile, the ventricles are thick because they pump blood to the body And you can see the left ventricle has a thicker muscle than the right, because the left ventricle has to pump blood to all parts of the body. Well, now valves. Now all the valves of the heart with the blood vessels as well are adapted to open to allow blood to flow in one direction and closes to prevent a backflow here. So you have the bicuspid valves here between the left atrium and the left ventricle. You have the tricuspid valves here between the right atrium and the left atrium. And then you have the pulmonary valve here at the beginning of the pulmonary artery in the right ventricle. And then you have the aortic valve at the beginning of the aorta here. As you can see, these are the valves. All these valves, they are able to open to allow blood to flow in one direction. Blood flows in these vessels, blood will not flow back. These are the valves. So we have looked at cuspid and the aortic and the pulmonary valves. Now we want to look at this papillary muscle and chordae tendineae hamstrings. Now the muscle of the ventricles are thick and parts of it are raised up areas or pillar-like areas. These are the papillary muscles, all these raised up areas that are raised into the cavity of the ventricles. Those are the papillary muscles, raised up areas into the cavity of the ventricles. These muscles have attached on them fibrous cords, and these fibrous cords are the chordae tendineae. These cords attach onto the papillary muscles and the caps of the atrioventricular valves. So we have papillary muscle and then cords attaching onto the cuspid valves. The same thing in the left ventricle. The function of these is that when the papillary muscles contract, the papillary muscles pull on the cords. What happens is that when blood flow from the atrium into the ventricle, these atrioventricular valves open to let blood flow from here into here. The valves open to allow blood to flow. So the atria contracts and blood flows from the atria into the ventricle while the valves are open. Now, when the ventricles contract, these valves, atrioventricular valves, must close so that the blood doesn't flow from the ventricle into the atrium. So, as the ventricles contract, these valves close. But the pressure of the contraction of the ventricles can cause these flaps to open into the atria. Now, the cords make sure that the valves do not open and flap into the atrium, because when the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles also contract and pull the cords to make sure that these valves just close and don't flip into the atrium as the ventricles contract. That is the function of the papillary muscles and the cords, to make sure that the valves close but do not turn into here to let the blood flow. Very neat adaptation. Now we have looked at these valves. These are the atrioventricular valves between atrium and ventricle, bicuspid, tricuspid. Then you have the aortic valve and the pulmonary valves, making sure that blood flows in one direction into the aorta and will not allow blood to flow back. Now, beside these valves, the vena cavae and the pulmonary vein, they don't have valves. How do they check that blood flow only here and blood will not flow back? The vessels have thick rings at the entrance into the atria. So there are thick rings of muscle around here, thick ring of muscles around here, which when blood has come in and these atria contract, blood will not flow back into these vessels because the rings here of muscle squeeze and closes the vessels. So beside the valves controlling blood flow in right direction, the valves we talked about, the papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae, the muscle at the entrance of the anterior vena cava, posterior vena cava, pulmonary veins, the muscles at the entrance of these vessels are thick rings which will also squeeze and close when these atria contract, let blood flow, so that blood doesn't flow back into the vena cava and into here. Very neat adaptation. Now we want to look at the muscle of the heart again, looking at its myogenic nature and then the nodes, sinoatrial node and atrioventricular node. Now, as we have said, the whole heart is myogenic. It means the heart muscle can contract on its own. It is not neurogenic. It doesn't need nerves to contract. What happens is that each of the muscles can contract on its own, but the rhythmic contraction of the heart is controlled. The rhythmic contractions of the heart is started from this sinoatrial node, which is found in the right atrium where the vena cavae enter. All right, so you have this sinoatrial node. It's a special type of heart muscle with very little nerve fibers. That is what starts the contractions of the whole heart. So each of the muscle can contract, but this is known as the pacemaker. It starts the contraction and gingers all the other muscles to contract so that the contraction is rhythmic. Now, when the sinoatrial node contracts, the atria contracts, and the contractions reach the atrioventricular node, which also sends its signals to this nerve structure that is called bundle of sheath that is in the septum. So the atrioventricular node causes the contraction that started from the pacemaker to reach the ventricles and enables the whole ventricles also to contract. We are now going to quickly look at the heart sounds. Now, we want to briefly look at heart sounds, the sounds that the heart generates that is produced because of the valves and the contractions of the ventricles. Now, there are two sounds, and both sounds are produced when the ventricles contract. And the ventricles contract is also known as systole. Contraction of heart is known as systole. Relaxation of the heart is known as diastole. Now, these two sounds, the first sound is lab, and this sound is produced at the beginning of the contractions of the ventricles as these cuspid valves close. So as these at the onset, just the beginning of these contractions, these cuspid valves must close so that the blood will not flow into the atria. And as the cuspid valves close, the sound lab occurs. That is at the beginning. Now, the second sound is dub sound. And this dub sound also occurs at the end of the contraction of the ventricles as the aortic valve and the pulmonary valves close to prevent a backflow. So at the end of the ventricles contracting, as the ventricles contract, blood will flow out. And when it is ended, these valves will have to close to prevent a backflow. And that is when these valves close, then the dub sound occurs. So it occurs just at the beginning of the relaxation of the whole heart, that is diastole. So the heart sounds are produced as the valves close. and the way the heart valves close gives an indication also how the heart is healthy or not. One of the things that show that the heart is working well is the heart sounds. Well, this is where we end the lesson. Give us your likes and do subscribe. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.